Hello and welcome everyone back to the third day of the 2021 EC DataWorks virtual conference. I'm very excited to introduce some of our upcoming activities for today. And I also want to remind you of what's yet to come. We are now beginning Wednesday and we will hear from our keynote speaker today. Then follow that with an optional workshop and a social event. Coming up, though, in the next few days, we still have much more planned that I want to remind you of. On each day, we will have a panel, and these will offer insight into two components of building resilient data analytics. Tomorrow, we will hear from federal staff across a few different agencies about the need for an early childhood integrated data system and how to measure success of a complicated and ongoing development cycle. And on Friday, we'll hear from a state, a foundation, and a federal officer about developing strategic partnerships. If you're having any trouble, please get in touch with us. The contact here is for Bridget, and she is ready to help with any issues that you may have. You can also reach out to us through our websites and get connected with some of the materials that are part of this conference, but also you may find interesting for some of our other work. I invite you to go and explore those sites. And you can also connect with us online through social media, both through our LinkedIn community and on Twitter. So please do reach us there. Tonight, we will have another social networking event for those that would like some virtual in real life opportunities for peer exchange and getting to know each other. So we will have a Philadelphia virtual tour scavenger hunt and then another trivia night tomorrow. Come and win some prizes. Please also look now in the chat for a link where you can go and vote now for states to win honorary awards at ECIDS Excellence. There are 3 categories and we've already received nominations for these categories. So it's time now to go and vote. The categories are for ECIDS Progress, Analytic Innovation, and Data in Action. So now I get to introduce our keynote speaker and the topic. I'm actually very excited to introduce Dr. Iheoma Iruka, because already during this conference, I have heard people express interest in this talk and the fascinating title, What's Missing and Why Does It Matter? I think this question resonates with many of us because we know there's quite a bit that can feel like it's missing from our state data systems, and there's no limit to the amount of information that could be added. But it's also true that we can learn about our systems by thinking about what we do and do not prioritize. State leaders are accustomed to having limited information when making decisions, and that's normal. And designing an ECIDS for decision makers is a dubious activity, and sometimes you have to make hard choices in prioritizing the data that seems most relevant and useful within the restricted set of options for policy and operations. The problem is not what do we have or don't we have. The challenge is also what can we do with the information? Can we act on this? And connecting those dots from data to decision making is a real challenge. So the point here is that using data for policy and decision making will always be a little bit imperfect. And we should be using the best available data to provide the most feasible services and programs that will deliver the best equitable benefits for children and families. So I want to tell a quick story, a true story. It's often taught in statistics classes, but it's been turned into a sort of a parlor game of gotcha. The story is during the war effort of World War II, the Allied forces enlisted a lot of the brightest minds in the fields to solve tricky problems in linguistics and physics and statistics also. And one such problem was that there were too many planes that would fly out and they would come back and they'd be riddled with holes from bullets. And actually many planes never made it back. And they needed to add armor to the planes so that they could be protected. However, if they the planes couldn't be fully armored because they would never be able to take off. So the challenge was to figure out where to place just enough armor on the planes that would be able to protect them, but still be able to fly. A statistician named Abraham Wald, who made many contributions in statistics for coming over issues of endogeneity, like local average treatment effect and two-stage least squares. And Wald said, we need data. We need to get some data before we can really make a decision here. So the Navy brought Abraham Wald diagrams of planes that were returning, and they drew precise locations for all the bullet holes, marking where every bullet hole had entered, every plane that returned. And as they began to look at these diagrams and to compile all of the data, it became clear that there were clusters of bullet holes that were centered on the tail and wings of the planes. So the Navy sort of thanked Wald, and they said, oh, this data seems very conclusive. These planes need armor on the wings and tails. And that seemed like the right answer until Wald explained their mistake. See, many planes did not make it back to the base. Only the planes in the diagrams were the ones that did make it back. So clearly, to Wald, the data was showing that bullet holes in the wings and the tail did not prevent planes from flying, and that the vulnerable parts were actually in the belly and in the engine. So the insight here that I'd like to make is that sometimes it's the missing data that tells the most important story. And this solution that he had saved many flights coming back. So if the data is then missing, we should give some attention to that and try to understand why some information might not be present in our reports, in our data sets. And if I can try to relate this back to the work of state agencies, developing integrated data systems for public administration that serve children and families, let me just ask, in many states, we have distributed competitive funding, right? Such as for pre-K enrollment slots. And one thing that we might want to ensure is that those slots are being distributed equitably. And oftentimes we might look at the community demographics. But one thing that I have not seen done much is to look at the business owners. And we might ask, are actually the pre-K slots being distributed equitably based on, distributed to minority-owned business enterprises? And do we collect that data? And do we know the answer to that? Perhaps not. But even if we were to collect that information and we knew the percent of minority-owned pre-K facilities that were out there, we would be able to compare that to the distribution of the slots being distributed, and that might potentially reveal a disproportionality in pre-K funding allocations. Perhaps we could even then adjust our limited funding to try to make that a little bit more equitable. But what might Abraham Wald say? Would he think that would be a good idea? If we ensure that the pre-K slots are distributed among eligible business enterprises in a way that does reflect the proportionality of factors such as owner's race, we may still fail to consider other barriers of business operations, which are each disproportionate by race, including inability to access project bonds or capital financing, overconcentration of low quality, low cost supply in certain neighborhoods, insufficient human capital of staff with degree attainment to meet state thresholds for quality on career lattice, credit opportunities. There are many areas in which the numbers tell us a clear story of disproportionate access to certain types of business financing and operations. So then if we were to collect information about owner's race and come up with a equitable funding allocation, that race neutral policy would achieve and potentially reinforce a status quo of structural disproportionality. And Abraham Wald might not ask about the types of data that are missing, but he might actually ask who is missing in the counts and why. So with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Iheoma Iruka, who I'm very excited to hear speak more on this topic and give some perspective on an equity lens to understanding the data that is not part of our current data systems, what's missing and why. Okay. Dr. Iruka is a research professor at the Department of Public Policy, a fellow at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute, and the director of the Equity Research Action Coalition at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Iheoma is a research professor, a fellow, and a director there, and she's engaged in projects and initiatives focused on how evidence-informed policies, systems, and practices in early education can support the optimal development and experiences of children from marginalized families and communities, such as through family engagement and support, quality rating and improvement systems, and early care and education systems and programs. She has been engaged in addressing how best to ensure well-being and excellence for young diverse learners, especially Black children and their families, such as through classroom and family tools, examination of non-traditional pedagogical approaches, public policies, and publications geared toward early education practitioners and policymakers. She served on numerous national boards and committees, including Brady Education Foundation, Trust for Learning Board, and the National Academy of Sciences for Engineering and Medicine committees. Thank you, and I'll invite you, Dr. Iruka, to take over, share your slides, and look forward to hearing what you have.
Well, thank you so much, Phil. I'm so pleased to be here with you all. I appreciate the introduction, but also really the story. I think is, I think it sets me up so beautifully. So thank you for that. I want to say hello to everybody who's both in the Zoom meeting here, but also who I know there's those who are also either on YouTube land, I can't remember which land, but somewhere. So thank you for taking some time out of your schedule. And, for those of us who are dealing with so much, whether it's the Texas cold and not have electricity and water, to clearly still the global pandemic, and of course, all the issues around the racial reckoning. So there's so much going on. So I hope everybody's at least taking time for themselves, as well as their loved ones. And yes, I am back at UNC Chapel Hill after a few years that I left to go, try other things at other universities and other organizations. But I really came back to really begin to launch a new area called the Equity Research Action Coalition. And really the idea is perfect for this, because especially to what Phil was actually talking about, which is that, here we have researchers on one end, then we have those who are really working with our children and families, who are the providers, the professionals, the educators. And then we also have sort of the state administrators and policymakers, right? And sometimes we literally are not in the same room. And so to me, data is only, is really supposed to be used for action of some sort, whether on the program end or on the policy end. And research should really be working in service to that. And so the idea of the coalition is really to how do we bring all that together in a much more coordinated, seamless way. Because we can't expect those who are state administrators, those who are really doing all this data response and action, to do it all alone. And we can't, expect researchers to find the answer and give it to you. So really, that's the idea of really my work. And so I'm really, really glad to be here with you all. Feel free to use the chat box. I know Phil and team will monitor it. But also for those at least who are here in Zoom, also feel free if you would like to chime in. I have 2 young kids. I'm kind of used to interruption, and I'm one of 7 girls. So again, very used to interruption because, that's life. So just thank you again. And so I wanted to kind of start with sort of my take home message. So for those who may have to go check on a baby, go check, have an emergency call or whatever, I want you to kind of know, what do I see as a take home message? So for me, really, when I think about what's missing and what we need to do, I think that we have to sort of, and those who are thinking about sort of the data analytics, which is the theme of this conference, right, that we need to really begin to dig deeper, right? Like there's certain data points that we have, and we make some assumptions, either based on our expertise, on our experiences, or whatever we've heard, right? And we make assumptions. But what we rarely do is to do root cause analyses. And I think it's important that as you sort of construct or continue to revise and update your integrated data systems or any system, that part of that is to really begin to look at, when we have our data, what story is it telling us? Is it telling us just a story of what's happening today? Or is it telling us things that are also happening from before that's still being seen today? So really, how much is your data telling the full story, the full authentic story, especially under the guise of equity? And I particularly really think about issues of racial equity as the first layer. And of course, it's other intersectionality like gender, geography, economics, etc. But I always think about race as sort of the big root to a lot of a lot of things in the US, because that's how really the US was constructed. And then we must really address missing data if we're trying to really, what I would say, I'm pushing all of us to think about how do we really address anti-racism in early childhood writ large, whether in programming, but especially in policies. And if we're using data to make policy-driven decisions, then we have to really begin to examine what data is missing. What do we need to do to really ensure that our policies are anti-racist and really at the minimal are equitable, right? And that's, and I'll define what do I mean what do I mean by equity, and how does data fit into that? And then I always say that to me, I think of myself as a researcher in terms of, methodologist. I love data. And so how do we think about sort of data analytics, especially with an equity-centered lens? I think it's literally everywhere. And so the question is, do we have the mindset? Do we have the lens to really push on sort of this issue of using data for action? And that's really how I think about data analytics in many ways. And also it has to be used for a tool. Like a lot of us, I think we think about, okay, my job is to sort of run this data or to respond to a question from a stakeholder, a boss, a state director or whatever, right? And that's it, right? But could part of our job also be that we are attendant to the inequities, but also using our data to disrupt inequities, but also that leads to justice, right? And so could we be the disruptor of injustices in a way, again, using the data? But that means that we have to at least have enough of robust data, and as well as data system in many instances, but also begin to really tell the story using the data that we do have, and then begin to figure out where are the missing holes, so that when I am queried by different people, I can respond in a very eloquent, data-driven, science-driven kind of way, right? So that's a take-home message, right? That your role as a sort of data purveyor, or if you're creating a data system, is that your data really has a full purpose, right? Is to tell the story of what is going well, what is not going well, and to be able to tell the narrative that fully centers, particularly those who have been marginalized, in a historical way, to center their experiences so that the response to it can be monitored, but also really that the response to it also has action that actually addresses it in a very equitable way, but really addresses the underlying root causes and not just the periphery kind of issues of like, oh, okay, we don't have any slots. But it's probably a much deeper issue, right? Just as Phil articulated, it could be with the minority serving providers, there could be deeper issues that we have not fully interrogated. And if our data does not have that, then that'll be a problem. Hold on, my coworker's visited me, so excuse me if you hear my coworker, aka my son. Sorry. Okay. Okay. Sorry, my coworker was here for a minute. So in terms of how do I think about building equity-centered data analytics and mindset, right? How do we do that, right? Let's remember that part of how do we define equity is that equity is about everyone having an opportunity to thrive, right? And that's important. And also that part of it is not just about thriving and reaching your potential, but it's also about removing any obstacles, right? So in many instances, we never think about what are the obstacles to sort of any of the inequities that exist, right? I focus, as I said already, on racial equity, as that is a singular factor that I think is predictive above and beyond even economics, in terms of children's access, experiences, and outcomes. So it is the foundation of this country. So I think of that really important, like it's sort of really important, along with other intersectionality like gender, geography, ability. And so really, when we think about sort of how do we build this equity-centered resilient data analytics, we have to begin to think about what is the definition, what is the mindset? And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So how do we define it? So this is how I define it. I kind of pull from all my literature, all my research, all those and other works for others, right? So to me, data analytics can help us see who does not have a fair and just opportunity to thrive. It can also show us the potential obstacles and barriers that are in existence, as well as other solutions, right, that could be activated, or solutions that are not working, particularly if they're not working equitably. So that means that equity-centered data analytics is the practice of seeing inequities and injustices as well as examine how the solutions or interventions being prepared are mitigating or potentially exacerbating inequities, both through interrogation of your data, your indicators, your analyses, your interpretation, right? So here's an example. I was literally just in a meeting, really, where we were talking about sort of segregation, right? Just segregation, both in terms of how it is in terms of public schools. And so the question is, for early childhood, we do know there's a high number of children, particularly children of color, who are in segregated early childhood education programs. Now the question is, okay, do we have that number? Actually, some of us, our systems don't cover that. It doesn't tell us where our kids are for the most part, right? That's the challenge. It doesn't tell us whether they're in segregated settings. That's the challenge. I think Phil has kind of alluded to that. However, it doesn't tell us, does that mean that it's a negative thing, right? Does our data system tell us that if children of color, for example, are in segregated settings, is that a bad thing, right? Some people may say, well, sure, it must be because, being in a segregated community, particularly if you're Black or brown, is a bad thing. But is that true? Does the data bear that out? Why is that the case, right? Is it because of that's preference for families? Is it because of lack of transportation? Is it because of our historical policies that ensure that only certain people could enter certain communities? Like if you can't afford a certain place, say in Chapel Hill, you can't get in, right? Those are policies that existed from before. So being able to kind of think about what is the question, what are the problems we're trying to solve, and what are the data points? And then interrogating whether it's a good or bad thing. And from whose perspective is it good? So for some people, segregation is bad, doesn't even matter. But some people, it's like, that's a great thing. It's a space for children who are from similar backgrounds to be together, to heal together, to learn together using their culture, traditions, norms, and ways of speaking, right? And that's a great thing, but but from the policy, it may look bad, right? So again, it's how do we begin to use our data, or ask the question of, do we have data? And if so, how do we actually interpret that data? What analysis are we doing? What questions are we asking? So I think that's really the point of what, when we think about analytics, is how do we not just do the technical part, but how do we do the storytelling with the data that's authentic, not to sort of, I would say, the white-centered way of looking at things, but the centers, particularly communities of color and communities of low wealth, who usually is who we're looking for and thinking about. So here's an example, another example. It's like I put a whole bunch of data points, and if you can't read it, don't worry, I'll sort of read them out to you. So here's data that tells about Black children. So we have data about there are 2.7 million Black children, give or take, since the ACS in 2018. About 11 and a half Black infants die out of about 1,000 live births. About 16% of Black infants are born preterm, and that's compared to 10% for white infants. 13% of Black infants are born low birth weight, compared to 7% of white infants. 66% of Black children live in low income households. Over 25% of Black children live in high poverty neighborhoods. And that's again based on education, income, et cetera. And then over 75% of Black children experience low to medium childcare arrangements, again, based on some of our standardized quality assessments. And about 15% of Black children are suspended, right, in preschool, compared to about 24% of white children. And then we see that 62% of Black children, 3 to 6 year olds, are not able to recognize all their letters of the alphabets. And then we have our data around over a 20-point gap in 4th grade reading and math between Black and white children. Right. So here's all these data points, right? Like somebody says, okay, what do we know about Black children in terms of infant mortality, or in terms of access to early care education, or in terms of the environment? So here's all the data. The question is, what does it tell you, right? What assumptions will you make when you see all this data points about Black children, especially in comparison to white children? What would it tell you if I didn't include the white children's number? Like, what are the assumptions will you make, right? What is the interpretation you would make, right? Right. So these are data points. But does it tell us the why things exist? Does it tell us that this is the metric, that this is the correct metric? Does it tell us what to do, right? Those are all questions that we have to begin to completely begin to sort of ask ourselves. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to go first. Hold on, sorry. My call was, hold on, sorry guys. Let me just get my, sorry, this is live, real, sorry. So I was saying, does it tell us the why, the how, and what to do? So this is where I really wanted to kind of lean into a little bit. Thank you, Phil. I know you write the life, right? You have everything prepared and your kids like, no, we need you right now.
Yeah, I know.
So I
It's
sort of,
like, I love you. Just get off the table, right? Okay.
thank you. So I sort of say, in terms of sort of when we look at our data, I wanted to, I want to kind of push all of us and push you to kind of think about the root causes. So when I showed you all those data points about Black children, particularly compared to white children, is I want you to kind of begin to sort of, I think, get into the mindset of equity. And I think that's really important how I sort of come into this space is around really the issue of equity and racial equity in particular. And for us to really get to this equitable space, we can't sort of just look at just today. We have to look at yesterday in many ways. We have to look at even 50 years ago and sometimes even 400 years ago. And so when I showed you all that data about Black children, we have similar data for Latino children and similar data for children from indigenous communities, right? Where we have some shared differences, but obviously some other areas. Um, but it's important that we use our data to kind of begin to inquire about what are some of the root causes, because then that can help us to say what is missing, what do we not have. So I borrowed this figure from public health, right? Because public health in many ways is like early childhood, right? Part of it is that there's a lot of disparities in health disparities, and we see that now with COVID-19, of course. And the question is, how do we begin to solve the today problem, but knowing that long term we have to solve all the issues that came before today. And so this I borrow heavily from them to kind of construct the social determinants of early learning. And so part of that is that we have to begin to interrogate, right, the political context, right, whether it's about housing, about labor laws, about schools, right? So these are things that are sort of written in our policy regs, all these regulations, right, and all of our strategies. And we know that a lot of those sort of socioeconomic and macroeconomics sort of decisions are leading to sort of families and individual socioeconomic positioning, right? So if policies about labor impacts you as an individual, impacts a family, et cetera. And that also impacts sort of children's experiences. It impacts early care education. And here, I'll give you an example. So here's an example of, you know, children's outcomes. Let's think about children's outcomes on the back end. So we have policies around housing, right, in terms of sort of either the quality, the safety of it, but even just housing in terms of accessibility. And we also have banking policies about, who gets to qualify for certain kinds of loans, right? What's the term that they set, right? But those kind of rules that impact whether or not a family could afford a particular house and a particular location. And that location in many ways can determine the kind of access, the kind of experiences, right? So here I live in North Carolina, the Great Triangle area, right? And so depending on what part of the area you live in, it could say whether you have access to the kind of quality education you want for your young child or not, whether it's affordable or whether the state is contributing a lot to make sure that it is affordable, right? Those are policies that are there or not there, right? And that could also create disparities of access, disparities of experiences, and then it's subsequently disparities of outcomes, right? So when you think about this sort of chain and events, my question to you all and to us is, what is the role of data in this, right? Like, what data do we need? What data don't we even have? And what are we trying to address, right? So the question becomes, what is our question? Our question is, how do housing policies and banking policies impact us, right? So those are really important sort of things that we have to deal with. So I want to kind of see the chat box and say, are there any sort of thoughts about what kind of data do we need for this kind of question?
And while those are coming in, thank you, Iheoma. You know, disproportionality in infant mortality by race is a national disgrace. And one of the goals of early childhood integrated data system is to think about not only evidence-based decision making, but about sort of multi-system involvement. And so as questions are coming in terms of thinking about the data that are important, I wonder if you could also talk about what are the risks of keeping data siloed? What are the consequences of our inability to connect the dots across these many systems that need to work together?
I think that's such a great question, Phil. I feel like this is when we think about sort of how do we make sure that children have a vibrant, first of all, we know the first years matter, right? Like that we know from science. And we know that children's life is impacted by various systems, by various agencies, et cetera, et cetera. And so to me, what has been, and that's why I kind of leaning a little bit on public health, is because I think it's by continuing to be siloed in our data, that also means that we are also siloed in the solution, right? When I think about a young baby, right, a young child, say the first 3 years of life, they're likely going to sort of be interfacing with whether it's obviously the pediatrician, some, potentially medical, or, health and human services on one end. They may be interfacing with sort of the subsidy world if that's what they need. They may be interfacing with the family support world, eventually maybe education, right? So even the first 3, 4, even the first 5 years of life, there's a lot of different both organizations, agents they may interface with. And if we don't begin to sort of understand that the data should not be about what is comfortable for me, my agency, right? Without acknowledging that if our data is not in service of children, but really the families that they are part of, that we're just basically doing something that makes us feel better, but really doesn't make their life any better. And I think it makes then decision, like that whole science-based decision, pretty hard. It makes it, like think about criminal justice, how much it interfaces in children's lives, right? Think about school and how it interfaces in children's lives. Health and Human Services, which is a huge conglomerate in of itself, with all of the different agencies under that in of itself. So I feel like that has been a danger both to the data part, but also to the solution and the work parts. And I think that's what, I feel like in every national academy I've been a part of, I swear, there's always at least one recommendation that says cross systems work, cross systems data. And we know we have to do it. But the question is there a will? Is there sort of guidance and guidelines that allows that? Because we do see that people are stopped. Like, nope, I can't share this data with you. Like, Ed, I can't share the data because it's proprietary or because you don't have any sort of data use agreement. But that's not how it works, right? So I think that we have to begin to push, if we're trying to solve real life problems like climate change, right, which actually impacts schools, right? Like one of my colleagues, Cassandra Davis, who does a lot of that. So if we don't begin to sort of intersect in all these like housing, criminal justice, climate change, education, early childhood, I feel like that a lot of us are doing a lot of work without a lot of progress. But again, I know it's really hard. And I'm so thrilled that at least with the early child integrated data systems, we could actually move that forward because children are located in many spaces, at least within the agency world. So I am very hopeful, but I know it's going to take a while and better data systems.
Thank you. And if you don't mind me reading a few of the comments and questions before you move on.
Of course.
One comment, appreciate the focus on structural equity, especially on who gets counted and how the data continues to be narrated by the dominant power, sort of reifying the social construction of poverty through data. Two comments came in related to housing, so it might be good to have you comment.
Yep.
I'll read them both. One, would environmental regulations and pollution be tied in with housing, or is that more public policies housing? And the other is, what is available as it relates to housing banking? Is there access to housing banking?
So I love these questions, and I feel like it gets at exactly sort of, because we know that the issue of housing and environment actually impacts young children, right? Like we know, for example, I was at high school, which meant I was, obviously interfacing a lot with Michigan, and we know the Flint water crisis, which actually is in existence in almost every urban sector, which is the majority Black population. So we know that issue is problematic, and we don't gather data on that. At least we don't include it in our early childhood sort of work. So I think in terms of sort of the issue of housing, actually the issue is that they could be in health and human services, but they could also be in environmental regulations. I feel like they're kind of in many ways all over the place, right? Like we can find it all over the place. But I think the question is, what data do we need, right? So do we want to have data around, do children have safe safe, stable housing, right? Do we begin to gather that data? And some of our, I would say, environmental health data systems, at least like I think in CDC, like the data sets, they do gather some of that. So I think that's one. I think that's one part of it. But even the issue of whether the housing is affordable is another thing. And that can live in our tax regulations, whether families are spending a lot more of their income on housing, right? So that means is it accessible, equitable, all that kind of stuff. And so that's another sort of marker of inequities. If families are spending a lot of their dollars on housing, that means that their available funds for childcare or even any kind of other early care and education supports is likely impacted. And we don't capture that either, right? So I think a lot of these sort of queries that we have around how this housing eventually impact children or even impact access to high quality, affordable early care education. It all sits, I think it sits in many spaces, but I think this is where we begin to talk to our state houses to say, if we really know that housing is important, but also families being able to have money to access the kind of early care education options they want, we have to begin to kind of have these triangulated conversations to make that possible. And then I couldn't remember the second question, whether it was about just environment writ large. What was the second
I think
one?
it was related to pollution, and I have to
Oh, wait.
say the questions and the statements of excitement about this topic and interest are coming in very quickly. And I know that you have more than half of your talks still
Yeah,
remaining. But
yeah,
yes, you're
yeah,
right. There was a comment also about pollution that was
yeah,
associated.
yeah. Thank you. So yeah, and we can, I mean, please talk amongst yourself, and when obviously I'll stop sharing, we could all talk together. So I think that's something really important, particularly around pollution environment. We this is where I think it's important for us to begin to even download data. We know that there's a national group that actually looks at where environmental toxins are emanating. And we already have a report, really, even from the last administration, that showed that many communities of color, and particularly if they are lower wealth, are likely to have these high level environmental toxins, right? And we know for us and our children, that impacts your cognitive development, that impacts your behavior development. So being able to not just capture whether you're a low wealth family, to access subsidy, but even the condition that you yourself and your family are operating under are really important, because then we begin to think about what are the solutions, and maybe why is our solution not working, right? We're busy targeting affordable care, but should we be actually going in coalition with housing, right? Or even environmental justice organizations and agencies to say, how do we make sure that our child care programs, early care education schools are not located in sort of these spaces of high toxicity, particularly around environmental toxins? And I think we don't talk enough about that. And so I think going back to Phil's question about how do we begin to have these cross-system conversations with children at the center, equity as the overall schema, knowing that if we don't have these conversations, whether it's about bank regulations that don't provide financial opportunities for families to build wealth and be able to access, if we don't talk about environmental toxins and climate change, and we know even for Texas, the people who actually experienced the worst of it were really, minoritized populations with low wealth, right? So that means that children are going to be experiencing the global pandemic in this horrible way, having to deal with all the climate change, whether it's cold weather or whether it's hurricane, aka Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, a decade or so ago. So I think we need to begin to think about social problems from a child-centered way, and using our data that has been fully triangulated from multiple sources to say we cannot solve this. We can't come to I hate to use this sort of phrase, but we can't come to a gunfight with a rubber knife, right? Like or a plastic knife. We really can't do that. And data to me is a powerful weapon when done well that could really say, here is the problem, a big picture, and here's at least how early childhood can be part of the solution, either in of itself or in collaboration with others. So I say let's keep talking about where some of, like, as you kind of think together, where are some of the areas that we can begin to say, hey, if we're thinking about advancing racial equity, particularly in a call for the Biden administration, are there some data that we can begin to think about, or agencies we should begin to say, hey, could we begin to collaborate or think about some integrated ways to incorporate some of that data that you probably have, to make sure that we're really understanding what our young children, particularly our infants and toddlers and our preschoolers, need to ensure that they are ready for school and life, but that we're not harming them on their way to matriculate into formal schooling. So thank you for those questions. Keep them coming. Keep the chat going together. And I just and again, and I could cut mine short too, so I don't want to be talking the whole time if there's even more discussion. But I have another example here about the rule of data, right? Example, the labor laws regarding who's an educator. Go ahead, Phil. You want to jump in?
No, I was going to offer to hold some
Okay.
questions that are coming in. Let folks know that we will get to those. I'll hold some of these
Absolutely.
though toward the end.
Okay. Okay. Um, so, like even the labor laws around education and early childhood, right? Early childhood, we know is a bifurcated system. How could early childhood integrated data systems really help us? How could using an equity frame help us? We know that, there are educators, early child educators from, birth through, age 5, age 8. And depending on what auspices, the setting, you literally make two different incomes and benefits, right? Um, So let's think about that, right? So there's labor laws that sort of say who is an educator, and so that then determines who gets what kind of pay and what kind of benefits. So now, if you're a school-based teacher, your benefits are different, right? Your pay is probably close to $30 an hour. If you're a community-based educator, again, the same number of children, the same age of children, you're making about $14.58. And you may or may not have benefits, and they're probably not that good quality in terms of access to healthcare, paid leave, paid sick leave. And during this time, we know that a lot of our community-based organizations, providers, had to be out there as essential workforce, but our school-based actually were allowed to operate from remotely. So again, what does that mean in terms of equity if we don't talk about how our system is inequitable, and then using our data to show that? And then that means that our educators who are in the CBOs are probably having likely dealing with a lot of stress themselves, are probably having children who have more stressors. What kind of quality care and learning are they providing? Again, it's not a fault of their own, is that the system has placed them as sort of these essential workforce who must stay open, but you don't get sick leave, you don't get full benefits, you don't even get $15 an hour, right? Again, what is the role of data to call out these inequities, but also call out what are the solutions that we see out there in the field, right? Do we pay people the same, or do we pay more? So again, what is the role of data in addressing even the workforce issue? The role of data to say we have a workforce shortage and will continue, as we go through this pandemic. And so what is the role of data to call these things out, tell the narrative about the history, about how education was classified under the labor laws, and then say, what do we do to address that, right? So how do we come together with data as sort of one of the core, but then create the solutions, and monitor those solutions, right? One thing that kind of gap gaze, and so here's all the bad things, but if we don't figure out the solution and then don't monitor the solutions, then we're likely to continue to see them continue. So what role can we play? Again, I can't be this enough, right? Is that, data to me is as somebody who, I love data, right? In many ways, both analyzing them, doing my HLM and but even basic data, right? Is it calls out the disparities, it calls out the inequities, it calls out the barriers. And I think that's fine. And I'm all for that. But at the same time, we have to begin to call out, where's the potential action, the justice part? Where do we begin to include how do we begin to think about equity in many ways? And really, what are the solutions for that? And I think this is where it gets hard, right? Like, I can call out everything that's wrong, and I could do that till the cows come home, but what are the solutions to it, and how do we begin to use our data frameworks to sort of say these are the solutions, but who are they working for, under what conditions, right? We have to begin to be much more sophisticated in order to solve our life challenges. So how do we sort of think about addressing missing data? Really, and that for me, in terms of my work, it's really thinking about, as a researcher, like, what are the policies that we can begin to really unearth or examine, revise, right? And so I'm going to lean into one of the reports that me and colleagues released in December, this past December, really about starting with equity as a roadmap. And really the idea is what are the markers for access, for experience and outcomes, right? If we're trying to put equity in the center of data and data analytics, especially, and using data as kind of our way to make decisions, right? Because that's the purpose of ECIDS, right? The Early Childhood Integrated Data System is to help us make decisions, to help policymakers make decisions, is to help administrators make good, sound decisions. But we have to at least have a vision for it and make sure that we have what we think we need. Again, I know we can't include every data under the sun. I get it. And we can't include all the data that researchers like me collect. I think that's not even reasonable. But what do we need? What is our vision for equitable access, experience, and outcomes? And so with our report, and I'm happy to share that, or I'll have Phil and team share that, it's sort of like, we want to ensure that opportunities, access, and impacts are not determined by your race, by your ethnicity, by your language, by your gender, by your socioeconomic status, religion, ability, whatever, name it, by where you live, right? We want to make sure that it's equitable. And that means that it cannot be determined by these socio-demographics, especially race, one of our biggest determinants. We want to make sure that everyone can access supports or services that they need to meet their potential, whatever it is, right? And that individuals and communities are healed and repaired from historical and past trauma. And I think that's really important. right? When people talk about equity, they think much more about the present time. Like, how do we make sure that children in poverty are able to access early education? How do we make sure that children are ready for school, right? We talk about it from the present, right? As opposed to like, well, all those policies and all those things never happened. Like, they happened. The pandemic is still with us, but all the things it's doing is going to have ripple effects for probably a couple of generations. I don't know, maybe, right? But that's the point. We can't, we have to figure out how do we begin to heal and repair people from historical and contemporary trauma, as well as challenges that really is not of their fault, but has been visited on them by the system that has been created. And I think that's something really important that we have to begin to say is, how do we think about root causes? And that's not trying to pin it on an individual, pin it on a family, or even on a program, right? Because again, it's a program, but how do we begin to kind of unearth what can we do differently to make sure that we are not in this position of placing families and children at the sort of at the risk of all the danger we put them in. And of course, I put reparations, right? That's sort of, when we think about issues of racial inequities or racial justices, the idea of reparations comes to mind, right? Again, I'm not advocating one way or the other. I'm not thinking about it from a political standpoint, but that's the idea of repairing, right? That part of data is to tell the story and making sure that we are making people whole. It's also to tell the whole story of individuals, right? We tell stories of families of poor, but really, are they just poor, or are they also their mothers, their fathers, their leaders in the community? They're also part of a workforce, probably, or a business owner. There's so much to that. Providers are not just providers or educators, they're leaders, their mothers, their grandparents, their caregivers. There's so many other things. So it's about thinking about this wholeness of people and how could data make people whole. And I think, how do we tell the full story? And I always think about Adichie's sort of the danger of a single story is to how to be careful that our data does not just sort of tell a single story. So in terms of the report, just to give you a sort of a snapshot, we sort of have these 14 priorities that we say this is a really important to dismantle systemic racism in early care education. And I'm just going to kind of give you a quick snapshot of a couple of them. And I'm just giving it to you more as sort of examples about what is missing. And what could we do if we're trying to move towards this equitable, I would say even anti-racist environment, right? If we're trying to use data to sort of center that, what could we begin to sort of think about either included in our data system, whether as a proxy, but what can we begin to do? So that's really my intention of sharing a couple of these highlights with you. And so one of one of our focus was really on embedded equity in our monitoring and in accountability systems, right? And for people, it's like, what does that mean? Like, people say, what equity sounds good, until you have to say, well, what does that mean in a system? What does that mean in terms of a data system, right? And luckily in our report, we do provide some examples, but really I want to just give you a sense of like, what do we mean by that, right? We're saying that for us, we're saying that we have to ask, the GAO, right, the Government Accountability Office, to report on equitable access to quality program and experiences, disparities, and outcomes. Like, we want a whole lot of data, right? And the federal agencies, along with states and tribal communities, ensure that all federal monitoring and accountability systems explicitly include equity indicators, right? So I'm going to give you sort of some of our thinking around what could be an equity indicator. How would you measure? Before I give it to you, if you have thoughts about what would you include as an equity indicator in our monitoring systems, in our standards, in our rating systems, what do you include either in your state systems to monitor quality or monitor access or monitor the outcomes, right? Like, what do you include, right? So we can't talk about equity if we don't have actual data, right? I think that is the rub that people have. So I'm gonna give just like 10 seconds and I'll give you kind of what we had just for time's sake. What do people include in their, or what would people think we should include to capture equity in our systems writ large? So I'll give us, about 10, 15 seconds to kind of write, and you can keep put in the chat and I'll share some examples. Just making sure I'm on time. So for those who are still thinking and querying, both, and for those who are not, I know, sorry, for those who are not in the Zoom room, I'll make it shorter for you. So here's some examples that we said for equity indicators for standards, monitoring, rating systems, and they're in the report. You can see it much bigger, but I'll just flag a couple of them. So we say really, that there should be some sort of metric around coaching and professional development on anti-racism pedagogy and even approaches. Like we want people to really be trained in that. Um, we want people to report around harsh discipline and exclusionary practices. Again, we collect that, but we be much deeper in that. We want to see if, bilingual lead teachers and other staff are available, especially if we have dual language learners in the classroom. Do we see that curriculum and pedagogy are delivered in a dual language model if more than a third of children share the same home language? We want to look at things around segregation, or really not even segregation, but really self-contained classrooms by funding stream, right? So this is not about segregation writ large. It's just about if you have, parent paying children versus those who are maybe funded by, subsidy or childcare scholarships, are they totally separate, right? Are they self-contained? So being able to capture that level of micro data, and of course, begin to track and address racial and other forms of workforce compensation inequities, right? Are we beginning to track whether our educators in community-based organizations are being paid the same as those of school-based programs, or even Head Start, right? So these are kind of just some of the equity indicators that we have flagged. There are others in the reports. But again, these are just things that we believe can be collected now, right? We have other ideas, but we thought that these are things that are really, could you collect this right today if you wanted to, as part of your equity indicators for your standards, your monitoring, and or your rating system. All right. So I'll move on. And if there's any high level questions, Phil, go ahead and flag it for me. And then was there? Okay.
No, can you go back
Okay.
to the slide?
Yep, I sure can.
This is a really great. Can you just speak a little bit because some of these are systems level, some of these are program level, some of these are classroom level indicators.
Yep.
And can you speak a little bit to how you think about equity, those different levels, and what it means to have sort of a collective impact?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question. Exactly. And these were really done on purpose. And obviously, if you see the whole report, you'll see that we kind of pulled from whether it's around the curriculum or around sort of the family engagement, et cetera. And so, exactly. So some of these, because we're thinking both in terms of standards in the classroom, like the micro system of the classroom, and some of them we're thinking much more around sort of the rating systems, or even the monitoring systems, right, that are not even just the QRIS, but really around sort of federal regulations or even state and tribal regulations. And so we try to, we think it's important that, and you'll see throughout the report that we really do have sort of this attention and intentionality towards sort of federal regulations that involves, federal agencies, but also Congress, and even regulations that are really specific to states and tribal sovereignties or governments, right? Because we know that, right, that children and families really, and even educators feel things much more at the local level. And we need to be able to sort of nest sort of the federal dollars and all the supports and resources. We need to make sure that they nest it also within the states, right, with all the states' rights and all those things, and also to how programs and communities may actually implement them. So really, we're trying to think through ways that we can begin to capture indicators that really at the high level of the feds, for example, but also options for states, right? As well as options for in classroom. I mean, the idea hopefully is that if you're collecting things at a more granular level, like at the classroom or even at the program, that those could be aggregated to sort of a community level, to a state level, and obviously to feed into sort of your integrated data systems, but also potentially to the federal level. Again, we're hoping that obviously with the Biden administration and all the agencies having to do an equity plan, we are also anticipating that some of them will be indicators, right? That you can't measure what you don't have, you can't measure what you don't see, what you don't expect, and you can't change what you don't see. So yeah, so some of these are really at the program level, like curriculum, even at the classroom, like bilingual teachers. And then some of them really are much more at the higher level, really around training on history of race and racism, et cetera. So if there's more questions, we can definitely have more discussion around on the chat around that, or at least during the Q&A, or at least really conversational time point, which is shortly, trust me. And then just, I wanted to kind of make sure that I really do talk about the workforce. There's such an important really driver of the system. If, some of us can argue, it's not really a child system yet. We're not a full unified system, but but if we're trying to really make sure that we have a system that remains even after the pandemic, that we have to talk about, workforce inequities. And we know that, early care education, sadly, is replete with inequities when we examine it by race in particular, or setting types, or job position, right? According to data from the Center for Child Care Employment at the University of California in Berkeley, we know that, more teachers of color, particularly Black and Brown teachers, teach infants. They teach in community-based programs, and we know those who are in school-based programs make a lot more. They have higher pay, more benefits, and also within that are also barriers to entry, right? Whether it's the praxis for those who have to be certified, and a lot of those are in many ways vestiges of what I would say are racism, right? That you create all these things that privileges one group while you oppress another from entering that to attain any kind of wealth or benefits. So we do know that there's a lot of inequities in that, with Black teachers, for example, making 78 cents to a dollar of a white teacher. And so that in of itself and that's on top of women as a whole making less than men. So obviously we have these embedded inequities, both in terms of early care education being a female dominated industry, but also then we have the racial part of it also, which really is a terrible thing when we think about the workforce and what has and their role in making sure that we have a workforce and a system. And so in our sort of world, we have sort of called on sort of this increase in funding to increase the workforce compensation. Again, these are policy drivers that we can begin to monitor. As I said, those are potential things we can monitor: inequities and disparities, and the solutions, right? So you cannot say, are states increasing the compensation of the workforce? Are they increasing their market rates in terms of how they're paying providers so they can get to the workforce in terms of increasing compensation? Um, are we able to provide different ways for those who may be paraprofessionals or others in non-lead teaching roles to become teachers? Again, because a lot of our teachers of color tend to be in the non-lead role, and that's really where a lot of our diversity lies, and there's a lot of inequities inherent in that. And so again, if you look at this report, you'll see a lot of spaces and places where we can kind of begin to delve into data points, right? What can we measure? We can measure pay parity across. We can look at, are there pay parity across different settings? We can look at it within individual teachers by race. Again, some of these things don't even exist. Sometimes we don't even collect data on the race of teachers. We don't collect, how much they make, right? So this is where we have to begin to, if we're trying to address equity in early childhood, we can't close our eyes and hope and wish and pray, right? We can't always depend on surveys to tell us a story. If our data systems are not capturing the experiences of our educators, the experiences of our children and families, then it's hard to fix something that you choose to not see. And I say choose because we choose what we prioritize. And I think Phil said this beautifully earlier. We prioritize what we want, right? And if we really care about our workforce, then we have to gather data that shows the beauty of our workforce, but also some of the great injustices of our workforce. And so, of course, we're lucky to have a lot of different centers that can provide data. But I think, we need to have it much more centralized, where state officials and those in state organizations, even local organizations, can call on those data to help them make decisions about whether there's solutions to address pay parity or inequities with the workforce is working. Are we bringing in more workforce, more people in the workforce who are going to stay, not because they can make more working at sort of Bird Eyes or making more at sort of Walmart, right? We people want to stay, but if they can't afford it to stay, then are we doing our job to maintain them? And so again, what can we measure even when we think about the workforce? And then, of course, I won't be this one. If you've heard me talk, I talk about suspension. But of course, we have heard a lot about the talk about harsh discipline, and we know that it's replete in early childhood. Again, we don't have a lot. We have data from, obviously, thank you to the Office of Civil Rights, but again, we don't have data around, what are the policies that the early care education programs and schools are using. We don't know who's dishing it out. We don't know who's using it. Who's prohibiting it, what policy seems to be working. So again, who is being excluded, who is being secluded, so we need to begin to access some of this data, and not, and I think it's good that the feds are collecting, but they don't collect things from the community-based organization unless they're funded by public dollars. So we need to begin to really capture some of this data so we understand that children who need it the most may likely be being pushed out. And I think, and we see that already. And so we need to begin to measure that, again, measure that, but also measure the solutions that are working. Did the Head Start and Department of Education statement around prohibiting a suspension expulsion, did that help? right? So do we have data backing that up? And if it didn't help, what do we need to do? Again, this is sort of a point of what data can we measure, what data should we collect in, and what solutions could we use for that? And then I'll just sort of raise up the early intervention, special education, inclusion. Again, another important area. If you're talking about equity, we know that really children of color are generally underrepresented in early intervention, particularly in the first years. They get identified much later in life, and they also have less quality interventions. And then when it comes to special ed, we do also know that they're over-identified in particular categories, like emotionally disturbed or language delayed, as opposed to say autism or other pervasive developmental disorders. Again, if we need to continue to say, you may have the data, are we disaggregating that? Are we sort of making sure that we are tying the knots between early intervention, early childhood programming, special education, and then obviously the handoff, or hopefully the warm handoff to the state longitudinal data system. So again, it's not just about early care education in terms of our data system, but also that connection to the state longitudinal systems and all the other systems. And I think this is to Phil's earlier question around the cross systems, is that how much is the data being passed on to shape policies around education, and how much is education, K to 12, also relying on early care education data to make decisions about workforce, about resources needed, whether social emotional health resources, or about the educators that are needed. And so again, how are states and education agencies writ large using the early childhood grade data system to make decisions? We should be having these conversations, not just about because of early intervention or special education, because we have a lot of connected issues across the life course. And then finally, I'll just sort of stop sort of with this one, and then I just have a couple of other slides to just close this up and really engage in conversation. And that's really around sort of dual language learners. Dual language learners really, they make up almost about a third of our young children under the age of 8. Most of them who obviously speak English at home, they're diverse in so many ways, I would say, right? Whether it's in terms of country of origin, their home environment, their family structure. And so there's a lot of strength they bring in terms of the cultural diversity and linguistic diversity. But their bilingualism is often overlooked, right? So even though we have all these bilingual learning models and immersions, they're less likely to actually access those, right? So the ones who can actually benefit of being in a bilingual immersion program are less likely to access it in our country here. And we know that that's an equity issue. And so, part of that is how to begin to capture data around not just look at all the dual language learners we have, yay. How do we capture whether their experiences are equitable? Are they accessing the programs that could best meet their needs? Are we capturing the experience that they're having and then the subsequent outcomes? Again, this is where I ask us, what are we collecting? If we have a group of children, a third and growing, obviously, right? We know that they're going to be they're a huge part of our country, number one, but they're a huge part of our early childhood community, number two. And so what data are we missing, right? That ensures that they have equitable access, equitable experiences, and obviously equitable outcomes. And again, this is for us to continue to think about that. And I'll also say that even for dual language learners, we also have children who speak a different kind of dialect at home. We have Black children who speak a different sort of language system. Do we capture those kind of things as well? So we need to begin to push on what is language, dual language learners, those who may speak a different dialect other than standard American English. Again, what can we begin to access so that we ensure that they're getting what they need and not what we think they need, right? So this is where data could be really instrumental to ensure that. And so I just want to end with just these couple of nuggets, right? What principles are guiding both the data that we have, right? Are we like, all right, this is the data we have, we're going to just make do and just pray for the best, right? No, I don't think we should stand for it. We know that our world is changing leaps and bounds. We went from literally kids should not be in front of a computer screen to like my kids are in front of a computer screen at least 3 to 4 hours a day. So right, we can easily change if we have to, right? We found $3 trillion. Hey, right? So I think that if we really want to see change, then we have to be part of that change making. And so we can't just say, okay, this is the data we have, we're going to just move on. But no, how do we push on our power and privilege that we have to get the data that we think is most important? And so the question is, what principles guide your data analytics? What principles guide the indicators you choose to either focus on, analyze, how you do it, right? And so I'll just call us on this particular imagery. Again, I remind you, I am a racial equity sort of provocateur. And really that's the work that I do. And I borrowed this slide from the National Equity Project to just as a reminder, right? When we think about equity, there's many equity positions, but obviously I really am centering this on around racial equity. And if we know the legacy of this country, and we know a lot of us, if not all of us, were really part of sort of making sure that, especially at the heels of the murder of George Floyd, that we recognize that there are many things in our system that's not equitable, that there's still historical injustices that are still in front of us. And so, that there are policies that were created, that first tried to eradicate natives and then obviously enslaved Black people in particular. And so we created policies and practices to ensure that white people and whiteness will remain sort of um, uh, at advantage, right? And others who are not white will be disadvantaged. And that's really the policies that we operate under still. And that those policies create disparities. There's systematic disparities, no matter whether you're looking at health data, economic data, crime data, education, no matter what data you look at, you see some of the same patterns. And it's not because individuals are less than, it's because the system created that. So that's the racial disparities that we often see. And then we know that those disparities tell a message. They give us a mindset that says, hey, only give this much support to this group of people because we believe that they're less than, they're less human, they're not smart, they blow money, they smoke crack, all these other pejorative things. Because again, all they do is affirm and confirm. And those create the biases that we have. And then the policies continue to work to operate in a way that maintains the disparities, they maintain our mindsets and our biases, and they keep going and going and going. And so I really believe, for me as a researcher and how I use data is that we really have to really try to stop really this cycle, right? We have to disrupt this cycle. That is part of how data could really be not just data for the sake of, but data for action. That part of it is that we use our data to look at how the policies are impacting groups of people, the experience of young children and their families, and how they continue to reify disparities and then reaffirm us about what we're doing must be correct. And so we have to disrupt the cycle of policies to disparities to mindsets and bias. And so part of the data could help us do that, help us to show the injustices, but also to show that, when you take away all of these the inequities, the systematic injustices, that better things will come from it, right? And so this is what data could do, is help us to disrupt this cycle in all of from the beginning to the end, really. And that's what I'm really imploring all of us to do. And so for me, it's going back to the take-home message that we need to sort of center all of our data, our indicators, the way we analyze it, we interpret it using the root cause analyses. Again, going back to that circle, right? The policies created disparities that created the way we see certain group of people. We then create policies to reaffirm that and create more disparities. So, so we have to continue to push on the root causes and using our data to do that. And we must address the missing data, right? If you're not collecting at the minimum racial data, then there's a problem. If you're not disaggregating them, that's the problem. But if you're not making sure that your interpretation is not strength-based, right, then that's the problem, right? So it's not just about collecting data and disaggregating, it's about what you do with it and the message you're telling. Because you can tell a lot of data in a really horrid way about groups of people, and we see that all the time, every single day. So it's definitely how you interpret them. And so we must think about the missing data in order to really advance equitable education policies. And then to me, data is everywhere. How you use it is everywhere, and how to make sure that we're not using it weaponized against groups of people who have no power and who have been historically oppressed. And really to use it as a way to disrupt injustices, to be right, data should be about justice. And so there are questions around housing, regulations about pollution, about how do we, raise up the inequities, how do we make that clear, how do we not gap gaze? I think it's truly important. So with that, I say thank you for listening to me yap on and on. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and say thank you, but let's engage in a conversation if we can.
Thank you, Iheoma. There have been some questions that come in, and I'll invite folks to continue to do so. You can also, if you'd like, let me know if you would prefer to unmute and directly ask. You had talked about a lot about choices and how the systems we have are combinations of choices that affirm and confirm. systems theory 101 is that systems are designed and maintained to achieve the results that we have. So when thinking about making a choice to change, you really, I think, introduced this idea that data is a point of entry at disrupting the cycle, and data can be helpful in doing that. You ended with some really, I think, good and provocative thoughts about challenging old data practices and terminology to sort of ensure that we have analytic approaches that are rigorous and that the inferences are grounded. One of the questions that came in was related to the use of different research methods with the data. And you're a researcher, so I think you can talk a lot about this. What's the importance of having some rigor built in so that we're not just telling stories with data, but we're reaching conclusions based on evidence?
That is such a great question, right? So rigor is one that we should. So rigor is kind of one that we should probably define, right? Because let's think about it. Some of us could say, rigor is an RCT, for example. Rigor is mostly quantitative data with actual numbers and objectives. And I would actually push back on that. So, like, as somebody who literally, I was trained in quantitative analysis, I was trained in sort of RCTs, right? I would say that part of that is really problematic in many ways, right? Because what you put in is what you get out. And so if you're trying to make sort of some systematic changes, it's hard to say, hey, you one community get this and you the other don't get this, and we'll do this randomization. And I think that's not the only way. I think we could still use our gold standard, but that's not the only way. And a lot of times our RCT, we have a lot of attrition to that, right? And a lot of times it's our families, our communities of color, communities of low wealth that really end up, so RCT don't end up working the way we intend for it to work. And so to me, part of it is that we can get rigor by also have a narrative, right? So this is where I really appreciate mixed methods. And we see this also used a lot in public health, right? Where you can have all your sort of your data system that captures population level challenges and even population level intervention. But in order to really make change, you have to know, why does something work? Why does something not work? And I think, when we use the word rigorous, it sort of supposes that there's something that's not rigorous. And it usually the qualitative part, right? That's really what we means, right? And so I think we have to begin to sort of say, why is it that the qualitative part is, as somebody who doesn't do a lot of qualitative, but I have done it, I think it's important that we begin to ask, why is that? Why is it that those who are anthropologists, for example, that's a lot of work. They spend a lot of time, really thinking about their approach, their interpretation, bringing the voice of others into it. And to me, rigor is something that we should really begin to define and question. Rigor for who? Rigor for what? Because I would say a lot of the RCTs that have been done have in many ways not actually helped, particularly families of color, people of color, to elevate, right? It said this work doesn't work. It doesn't tell us why did it work. It didn't tell us why did it not work. So I would say let's push a little bit more on how do we get the best evidence-based science or evidence-based data that can get to a solution that could work. Again, always asking, why did it not work for this group? Why not work for this child, this school, this program? And you can't do that with our data. We can't do that with only numbers. The numbers doesn't tell us the full story. And again, that's why I go back to Adichie's sort of comments, the danger of a single story. If we just use one methodology, I feel like we will lose the history that we have not fully unearthed, and we will lose the reasons why our answers either came out one way or the other. And so I would say the combination, at least methodology, is important. And also I would say we should challenge some of our analytical methods, even our analyses, like those we know for a fact. There's a colleague over at UK who talks a lot about, we have to begin to challenge even our methodology in terms of analyses, that those are not just objective. There's a lot of assumptions underneath those, and we can't just assume that. So I think this is our time to be much more interrogative and introspective about some of these things.
And that sentiment is showing up in a lot of the chat. Most of the comments at this point are just saying thank you, that this has been so great, that it's been thought-provoking, raising questions about data, and folks can't wait to see what they can go back and interrogate their data sets and see what the data shows as they have these conversations. So I wanna maybe close at this point and say thank you once again. This has been just a really great opportunity for our conference to hear from you as an expert in this, to help us in our thinking about ways that we can really progress the whole field and make sure that those that are participating here who are on the front lines of early childhood state integrated data systems have an opportunity to hear those perspectives as they go back and then have all the conversations that I think are going to be so important, making sure that we have the data and that we have the information available in order to really address and learn and to improve over time. Many more comments coming in just saying thank you. So,
well, thank you. Well, thank you so much. And go back to community members. I think those are important stakeholders who can really help you also move forward. So thank you for this opportunity.
Wonderful. And folks, if you have signed up for the optional workshop later, you can join us in about, well, let's see, that's going to be coming up very soon. There's a social event this evening, and otherwise we'll reconnect tomorrow.